Well, hello, everybody. My name is Tom Keep, as was introduced. I'm a PhD candidate in archaeology at the University of Melbourne, researching the use of, I suppose, virtual or digital applications of specifically rural heritage as a way of fostering engagement with archaeological collections, which might otherwise go unnoticed. But the Hellenic Museum collection is a different matter altogether. This was a bit of a side project for me, and I'm very happy to tell you all about it today. So the presentation today, we'll just have a quick overview, contextualizing the project and talking about what exactly were the outcomes we were hoping for and other similar projects that have been undertaken by other museums and institutions across the globe. We'll move on to the process, the particular process that I used. I'm sure this being a specialist audience, many of you grammetry is undertaken, but I personally always find it helpful to see what somebody else has done because you never know, their workflow might differ from yours and you can get some tips. And then finally, I'll talk about a couple of theoretical considerations because practice without theory isn't much at all. If you get bored while I'm speaking to you, have no shame. I encourage you to be bored. And please, instead of listening to me, go check out the Hellenic Museum's Sketchfab page where you can see all the models that have been created. I think there's about 70, something in that range, at sketchfab.com/Hellenic_museum. Okay, so a quick overview of everything. In brief, the work of the Hellenic Museum Digitization project was to create a library of 3D digital surrogates of the Hellenic Museum's material collection. The collection contains heritage materials relating to the contemporary understanding of Hellenismus or Greek cultural identity. So you've got things from Bronze Age Cyprus through to kind of classical Athens, Magna Graecia, and then there's some contemporary works which have been commissioned from by the museum, inspired by their collection. The project follows on from similar work undertaken by cultural institutions across the globe. Within Australasia, similar work has been undertaken by the Chow Chak Wing Museum of the University of Sydney and the Auckland Museum, although the Auckland Museum output is much more focused on natural history. More and more major and minor institutions have been making photogrammetry and online accessibility a priority, and the need for such access has been, I would say, made abundantly clear with the restrictions imposed by the COVID pandemic. At present, the British Museum, which I'm sure people are familiar with these models at this point, but they remain the most popular producer of photogrammetry models of heritage materials, with almost 300 models available on their Sketchfab page, and some of them getting, I think, almost 300,000 views on them, which is pretty incredible. Okay, so there are many, many, many potential applications, I think, of photogrammetry and 3D modeling for museum collections. And we're going to quickly go over these one by one. Don't feel the need to read it all now. This is just to illustrate that I think you get an abundance of options when you start to pursue an avenue like this. So the most immediate benefit of the creation of these models is distribution, I would say. Where the original objects can only be viewed in the museum, accessible only to those within travel distance, 3D models can be instantaneously distributed or accessed across the world to any interested party. The British Museum has quite clearly demonstrated that there is an interest in this level of access, with some of its models reaching 300,000 views. The Hellenic Museum Sketchfab page has not achieved quite such lofty heights, but several models have received near to 100 views on the page. And the page has just under 50 followers, with more regularly joining. Related to the notion of sharing is the question of access. Many sensitive sites require that visitors may not enter the space due to the risk of breath-causing damage to the materials. Sites such as the Tomb of Egypt or the Neolithic Caves of France have been modeled and uploaded to Sketchfab, providing anyone with the opportunity to access any space virtually, where previously physical access was exclusively restricted to researchers. Additionally, with the lockdowns we've faced over the past 2 years, I think we're all more conscious of how delicate our ability to access cultural collections really is. Making 3D models of collections available online ensures that even under extreme circumstances, the public is able to preserve their right to experience material culture. And I would argue that all cultural institutions would be wise to consider making this a top priority of their policy moving forward, because you never know when we're going to get another pandemic. Although Sketchfab is at present limited in its functionality, alternative platforms such as Pedestal 3D allow for users to undertake some basic analyses of the models. The University of Melbourne has recently begun exploring this platform for displaying their own models, allowing users to create their own cross-sections and view data related to the dimensions of the objects, as well as many other functions. These functions provide not only a wealth of information on the object, usually not available without viewing the original in person, but also have pedagogical benefits for archaeology in making the relationship between an object and a cross-section tangible and clear. Sometimes features of an object can be difficult to distinguish from the surrounding detail, but become apparent when the model is stripped of its texture. In this example from the Hellenic Museum, a sizable dent in the helmet was difficult to spot while viewing in person, where one's focus is distracted by the marine encrustation. But when the color is removed, it becomes clear and obvious. In some exceptional instances, inscribed writing, which was overgrown with lichen or moss, actually becomes visible again when it's been photomodeled and stripped of texture. There is some very interesting work being done in restoration using photogrammetry models. Potsherds by themselves can be a little bit underwhelming to general audiences, but by digitally restoring these vessels, by extracting the texture and completing the geometry and modeling software such as Blender, 3D modelers can provide a much clearer representation of the original vessel, as Piotr Lazansky has done here on a Polish Iron Age shirt. Inspired by work such as this, I've undertaken my own hypothetical restoration work on some of the objects from the Hellenic Museum's collection. This was accomplished by taking the geometry from photogrammetry models and applying new textures to them, selected as potentially indicative of the original appearance of the artifact. There is certainly a danger here of misrepresentation, of which I try to remain cognizant, but I'm personally of the perspective that a public museum collection is first and foremost for the benefit of general audiences, who stand to benefit more from being provided with considered hypothetical reconstructions than they do from being expected to understand what degraded remnants represent of the originals. The ability to physically reconstruct 3D modeled heritage objects is a complex and interesting prospect which has seen some major public applications in recent years. Most noticeably, the decision by the Institute for Digital Archaeology in Oxford to reconstruct the destroyed Palmyra Arch elicited much public and academic interest. Prime Minister Boris Johnson personally unveiled the reconstructed monument, proclaiming it as an act of, quote, defiance of the barbarians who destroyed the original of this arch, end quote, before flicking the two-fingered salute to the camera. Charming. I think the spectacle of performative conservation from the Prime Minister in his typical oratory style raises some questions that are quite interesting about how such models are to be used and who has the right to display them. Models may also be converted into 3D printable file types, allowing for the distribution of physical copies or even just in the gift shop for visitors. This application interestingly connects the new potential of photogrammetry modeling to the long-standing practice of plaster cast distribution popularized in the late 19th century. The sale or gift of plaster casts of major sculptural works allowed for museums to facilitate the study and appreciation of masterworks not in their permanent collection, without the expense and risk of damage incurred by transporting the original. By converting photogrammetry models into 3D printed models, today institutions with access to 3D printers could produce tangible representations of these models at any scale, almost at will, opening new opportunities for distribution and study. 3D models provide us with a level of freedom beyond what is possible with the original objects alone. Digital objects can be placed within new virtual environments, opening a range of possibilities for new contexts of viewing. Andrew Simpson spoke earlier today on the process of musealization of an object being one where an object is removed from its context and placed into the new context of the museum space, which imposes its own interpretive framework onto visitors. In the museum, objects tend to be perceived as works of art to be revered and appreciated, rather than pieces of an assemblage of a person's life in the past age. The artwork of Ai Weiwei has, I believe, done much to bring this reification or transubstantiation, of artifacts into art into question, as has much scholarship in museological studies. However, with 3D models of museum collections, I believe we may have the opportunity to have our museum and eat it too, so to speak. By importing photogrammetry models into 3D spaces, visitors to museums have the opportunity to experience the objects both in their museum context and in any number of other virtual contexts, and form a range of contextual perceptions, building a richer and more nuanced understanding of material culture in the process. Let me just see if this wants to work. You can all see that video? I'll take your silence as yes. So here you can see a video of a test project I'm working on using the software program 3D Vista, the same program Alberto Uchia presented on earlier today for his Egyptian rock art experience. I've used this software to create a kind of virtual gallery space, which can be accessed when the objects are in storage, or when a pandemic prevents people from visiting in person, or just to supplement or augment the existing displays. Hotspots have been used to link the objects in the virtual space to the interactive 3D models uploaded to Sketchfab, allowing users to have a closer look than they would in person and come to understand the objects in a slightly different way. The background space here, the virtual space I've used, was a Creative Commons license photogrammetry model of the Priene Fountain in Corinth. So this is a fun kind of way of, I suppose, almost returning the objects to their original context or some representation of it, but you could do any number of things, which I think is the most exciting thing. It gives you capacity to change. Such applications clearly have much potential for teaching experiences, and the University of Melbourne is progressively incorporating these into their Ancient World Studies program. Okay, so onto the process that I use. So just to quickly overview the workflow that I personally use to create these models, and then we can move on to the theoretical considerations. So I work on the assumption that most of you are at least familiar with photogrammetry, and I just like to quickly outline my personal process. So photographs were taken using a Nikon D5300 on manual settings with a 50mm lens to maintain consistency between photos. The objects were placed within a lightbox, and rotation was automated using a Folio 360 turntable with an X-Rite color checker card photographed alongside the object to control for the impact of light. The photographs were adjusted in Adobe Lightroom using X-Rite software to control the colors, and small adjustments made to exposure, contrast, clarity, and texture settings. Masks for the images were generated using Microsoft Paint 3D to reduce processing time and background noise. Modeling was undertaken within Agisoft Metashape with a standard workflow. If and when necessary, adjustments to the mesh would be made manually within Blender modeling software after remeshing in instant meshes to make the file more manageable. These can be huge file types, sometimes with millions of points, so it helps to reduce them before trying to edit them. Otherwise, your computer goes so slow that either it crashes or you do. The model will be imported back into Metashape for after it's remeshing and editing in Blender for retexturing the adjusted geometry. And this process would be repeated as necessary until the final model was satisfactory. Finally, the model would be uploaded to Sketchfab for sharing, and these uploads could be embedded into software such as 3D Vista for use in a virtual gallery space. So it's quite an involved process, but in the end, I think you get some really nice results out of it. So while these novel approaches are, I think, very interesting in their own right, if we are to conceive of the virtual gallery, the question must be raised of how virtual objects relate to the originals. What is the relationship between a digital representation and reality? To this end, I'd like to briefly discuss the theoretical perspectives of John Baudrillard. Baudrillard's landmark 1981 treatise, Simulacra and Simulation, aimed to tackle the prevalence and significance of simulacra in the postmodern world, which Baudrillard argued was uniquely impacted, perhaps irreversibly, by the pernicious substitution of empty signifiers in place of the real. His wide-ranging and indeed rambling discussion on the topic reflected on the role simulation played in the fabric of the postmodern condition, relating it to topics such as Watergate, the Gulf War, advertisement and branding, and perhaps most famously, Disneyland, because why not? Baudrillard is not great at defining his terms, and his writing is frequently more rhetorical than strictly analytic. A more cynical reader than myself might almost suspect he was deliberately obfuscating his ideas to make them difficult to falsify. But this is not at all to say that they are without merit. and indeed their vagueness does allow a degree of breadth, which may even have been his intent. Anyway, so Baudrillard identified 4 stages of the simulacrum, ranging from pure representation to pure simulation, which you can see here. And to quickly explain this, I would like to use this example taken from criticaltheory.com, I believe, of the pumpkin spice latte. The pumpkin, or a photograph of the pumpkin, being a true representation, the pumpkin pie being a masked or perverted representation of the pumpkin, only tangentially related to its reality. Pumpkin spice masks the absence of reality. It has no relationship to pumpkin whatsoever. And then the pumpkin spice latte, there's no relation to reality whatsoever. It is pure simulacrum. Skip over to this one. So at face value, photogrammetry represents the first tier of these series, which Baudrillard considers a good appearance. In effect, a simple representation, making no claim to replace the original, only to signify the existence of the real. The question of whether a representation is pure is difficult to answer, however. The final outcome of photogrammetry modeling is the culmination of a series of decisions to clean and edit along a series of steps. In this example of a marble relief, there are moderate confidence points displayed in orange, which I have the choice whether or not I wish to remove. In effect, I'm imposing my own decision-making, my own will onto what gets to be represented and what does not. It has to be a choice between whether the software has correctly identified the points or not. And similarly, intent enters into the images, which will be compiled in the creation of the object. You have to choose which angles they're from. You have to choose what amount of filtering you're going to do and what kind of editing you're going to do on them. So the question of whether it's a true representation is quite difficult to answer. Recalling the example of reconstructed Palmyra arch derived from 3D models, we can question the social function of such reconstructions. In his unveiling speech of the reconstruction, Boris Johnson evoked the reconstruction as a defiance of the barbarian, but critics noted that no information was provided on the role Assad played in the destruction of Palmyra, including his regime's use of the city as a prison for political dissidents. In effect, the reconstruction of the arch appeared to both censor the narrative and imply the absence of the irretrievable loss and suffering, which is the reality of the wars in Syria. The reconstruction implies a reality where loss can be restored instantaneously, where centuries of heritage can be reproduced in the middle of London. It masks the loss of the real. And in this final category of pure simulation, I would perhaps controversially put creations such as the Assassin's Creed video game series. I think it's careful to not be overly literal on no relation, because in a sense, there is a connection to a reality, but it has been filtered through so many lenses of signification that it is more the product of signifiers than reality itself. Baudrillard uses Disneyland as his exemplary case for pure simulation. The German pavilion of the Epcot Center bears little resemblance to the reality of Germany. It is the hyperreal simulation of German culture. Similarly, Assassin's Creed Odyssey may be seen as a hyperreal representation of ancient Greece, a Disneyland-style condensation of the perceived popular conceptions of the culture. So effectively, in conclusion, photogrammetry and digital representations of heritage objects are incredible tools, but they must be used very carefully. They can exist on any one of the strata of Baudrillard's identified levels of signification of reality and hyperreality. And I think the best way to go about this is to be open with what we're using, how we got there, explain our methodologies, and engage the public in their creation. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Tom. Very fascinating talk. I did notice you skipped over the Mario-Luigi comparison, which is one of my personal favorites.
Oh, I know, but I saw the 5-minute warning and I thought, I can't.
Completely fair, completely fair. We do have a few minutes if anyone wants to pop any questions in the chat. I do, as always, have questions, but I'll just wait to see if anyone else pops up. Well, we do have a hand up from Josephine. Sorry.
Hi.
Hello.
Oh, sorry, I don't have a camera on. Thank you, Tom. That was a really fascinating presentation, and I'm quite sympathetic to your reading of Baudrillard as well, and would have loved to have seen Super Mario too. My question is about how you worked with the curatorial staff or the academic, academic specialists in those objects in the Hellenic Museum, and what that relationship is like between the developer and the custodians of the objects.
Sure. So I worked very closely with the curator. I guess I was employed by them. It was technically an internship, but it's this weird thing where it was this government scheme where the government pays the museum and then the museum pays me. I highly recommend it. But I would work very closely with them, most notably when they were wanting to do public displays and stuff like that. They would like for me to talk to the patrons and visitors to the museum about it. And then when uploading them to Sketchfab, because I would provide information on them in the Sketchfab description, because too often objects are just uploaded and it's like thing, and that's ridiculous. So I would work with them to use their placard information and check with the information that they liked. And in terms of there's some interesting questions. We were quite lucky because much of the collection is privately owned and on like long-term loan to the museum. And there were questions about who gets to own the digital models, which I think were quite interesting. It so happened that the owners of the material collection didn't much care. They were just very easygoing about it. But I think it raises a very difficult and interesting question, particularly when you're talking about, let's say, the British Museum. If they wanted to do some of their Indigenous Australian materials, I think there would rightfully be big questions to be asked there.
Yeah, absolutely. That does open up another question around I suppose, I won't go into any further detail there, but it's kind of a mixed space.
I would say as well that I think one of the things the owners of the material collection particularly liked, and one of the reasons they didn't quibble about ownership over the 3D models, is this notion of digital repatriation. Almost exclusively, all of the owners of the collection are, I suppose, Greek diaspora, who moved here in the 1950s or earlier. And I think they quite like the idea of being able to return something of their personal collections to their homeland, and digital repatriation is a really cool way to go about that.
Okay, great, thank you.
Fantastic. Well, kind of following on from there, I had a bit of a question. I know you only mentioned it briefly, but the idea of 3D printing from these models, which, I think has a lot of possibilities. I know it's been used a bit in kind of things like dementia studies, people being able to re-experience objects they had from their childhood, that kind of thing. But I was wondering if you could maybe speak a bit to the ethics around that. I know, we've kind of touched on it, but would that be a case of choosing the right objects? Is there a right object to do that with? How might that look?
It's a good question. And we obviously have all those same problems of ownership and rights, especially if you wanted to sell them, then that's a big problem indeed. And then in terms of what can be used, to me, the most interesting possibility would be to fill out collections in a sense. So I think one of the, I guess, as a little anecdote, when I went to the Vatican Museum, I was furiously angry the entire time because they had everything in the world they could possibly want, and it was insane, the depth of their collection, and they could have complete collections of a particular type, and it was an incredible experience. And then the problem is you got lots of smaller museums which have a few select examples. And I think what would be great about 3D printing objects would be if they could be distributed to all the museums across the world who wanted them. And then if you have like a vase of a particular type, you can place it within a typology of 3D printed models, because you don't have access to the originals, but you can still tell that kind of narrative story with them, which I think is very interesting. And then many things like, so seal rings, signet rings and sealing rollers, being able to print those out, if it could be done in sufficient detail, could actually be used in like physical hands-on demonstrations, which I think shows their function a lot more vividly than having them in just a displays case ever could.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's such a fascinating kind of pathway to be going down. So good luck for your PhD as well.
Thank you very much.
And we might just let our next speaker set up. We'll start just when they're ready. I might introduce our next speaker as the time's just ticked over. So our next speaker is Athena Caroni, who'll be speaking about museums, new technologies, and museological approaches in post-COVID times. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello from me, from Greece. It's too early in the morning right here.
Oh, no.
6:30 in the morning, yeah.
Oh, thank you so much.
Nice to be with you, yeah. It's great. So give me just a minute to share my screen. Just a moment, please. Wait, excuse me.